No story in the world is more sorrowful than that of Romeo and Juliet, concludes the Duke in the most famous tale of two lovers. Yet, while Shakespeare's tragedy ends with Romeo and Juliet taking their own lives, our story unfolds differently. The creation of the Bordon family began in Missouri, where Michael and Catherine first met as schoolmates. Michael was captivated by Catherine, his radiant, blonde, and responsive classmate. In their later school years, he sought various ways to catch her attention, helping with homework and inviting her for walks. Over time, they became best friends, spending countless hours together, studying and sharing secrets. Their friendship gradually deepened into love, and Michael invited Catherine on a date where he confessed his feelings. Eventually, they married in a beautiful and memorable ceremony, vowing to love each other through all life's challenges. After 10 years of marriage, they relocated to Leitz, Pennsylvania. Leitz was founded by members of the Moravian Church in 1756, and it was inhabited by descendants of Moravian communities. The primary population of the town were faithful families who sought refuge in their oasis from the horrors of modern life. Life in the town was quiet and peaceful. Many families belonged to the Christian Amish community and led a lifestyle befitting a believer. Their life was simple, with people trying to do without many modern technologies. The Bordon family was deeply devout, so the choice of Lidditz was no accident. This suburb seemed perfectly suited for the birth and upbringing of children. Life flowed so calmly that a new day was just like the last. This was precisely what the Bordons were looking for: complete family solitude and creation in solitude with God. Michael served in the local church community and taught lessons in Sunday school. Catherine primarily managed the household and assisted her husband in his work. In the community, Michael worked more for spiritual wealth. For everyday worldly needs, he had to work as a manager at a printing company. In the following years, they had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Most families living in Lidditz were large, with some having more than 5 children, hoping to shield their children from the hardships and dangers of a larger world. Families regularly attended church while local teenagers joined youth groups and were homeschooled. Interactions between families were limited to joint religious societies and celebrations. The family idol created by Michael Bordon lasted for many years, with children being raised in faith and discipline. In the early 2000s, the eldest sons, having reached adulthood, went to university and moved to another city to study. This left 3 children at home who continued their homeschooling to the delight of their parents. Neighbors and the couple's few friends spoke highly of the children's upbringing and their diverse interests. Cara, Caitlin, and Daniel were exemplary, kind, and responsive. But it wasn't always this way. As the eldest daughter Cara entered her teenage years, it turned the family's traditional ways upside down. Despite her father's prohibitions, she began playing in the local soccer team, sneaking out to discos and thoughtlessly doing everything she had been forbidden to do before. The young beauty's behavior deeply shook her father. Many hours of talks and instructions did not resonate in Cara's heart. Reasons for arguments appeared, which time and again led to the young rebel's escape. The girl openly showed interest in young men and sought relationships. Thus, in 2005, 18-year-old David and 14-year-old Cara met in a support group for students involved in homeschooling issues. The young people, with their passionate hearts attracted to all things forbidden, quickly established warm, friendly relations. Secretly from their parents, they agreed and created social media profiles, where they began actively exchanging messages. The correspondence was lengthy and very emotional. They exchanged well-encoded messages to keep their communication secret from everyone as long as possible. After a while, exchanging letters was not enough and they began secretly meeting. At first, these were harmless walks in quiet, secluded places around the city. Then their friendly relationship evolved into a romantic one. They ran away together at night to discos and spent time together until morning. David was older and had already experienced first love and disappointment. Cara was so young that her new bright feelings could hardly be contained. She didn't just walk. She seemed to fly, and a happy smile never left her beautiful face. Meeting David brought back the obedient Cara to her parents. Her father was overjoyed, believing that the teenage challenges were a thing of the past. But Michael was mistaken. Only the fear of being discovered by her parents quelled the girl's inner fire as she hid her love from them. This deeply saddened Cara. She knew what their reaction to such early relationships would be, as she had been instilled with entirely different concepts of possible love between a man and a woman from childhood, trying to protect her from such knowledge for as long as possible. Fearing their parents' negative reaction, the young couple carefully guarded their secret. But sooner or later, all secrets come to light. One day, unable to hold back, Cara shared her secret with her sister. She showed her a photo of David, shared how their relationship began, and that they were so in love and determined to be together against all odds that they were ready to run away. Her sister, fearful for Cara, told their mother about the planned elopement. Thus, the secret of the young lovers was revealed. One early morning, the young woman climbed through the window into the house and quietly, like a mouse, went up to her room. Elated, Cara was returning from another date with her David. She entered her room and froze. Her mother was sitting on her bed. Everything became clear without words. After breakfast, a conversation took place in which her parents forbade her any relationship with the young man. They were shocked, having shielded their children from violence, controlled substances, and other negative stories that such misfortune had befallen them. Cara's father was so outraged and disappointed that he forbade her from leaving her room. That night, Cara Bordon spent in David's house. At 5:30 a.m., the young lover dropped her off near her house. They agreed that as soon as Cara safely returned to her room, she would send him a text message. However, the awaited message never came. David called her home several times and sent a few messages on social media. An hour later, Karen informed him that she was caught and asked him to come over so her parents could talk to him. David arrived at the appointed time. The conversation began with the father expressing deep indignation and forbidding the young man from seeing his daughter. Cara's parents' morals and stance were very conservative. They were categorically against relationships at their daughter's young age. Words of love did not touch the father's heart. He warned the young man that if he saw him with Cara again, he would be compelled to report him to the police for involvement with a minor. The lengthy, emotional conversation ended on a high note. Cara was locked in her room again, and David left with nothing. The young man got into his old car and drove away, crying for the first time over a girl, or maybe out of hurt that he was not taken seriously. The separation was very difficult. The lovers struggled greatly through the long days apart. They couldn't withstand the test of separation, so they devised a plan: deceive everyone by accepting Cara's father's conditions, pretend to break up, but continue their secret love. And they convincingly played the part of former lovers. In public places or at church, they didn't even greet each other. Cara's parents were appeased, convinced they had protected their daughter from a youthful mistake. David missed her terribly. In the evenings, he read Shakespeare, imagining openly serenading his beloved like Romeo. But in the Capulet and Montague tragedy, the lovers could not reconcile their families and receive their blessing. David Ludwig took decisive action. He called Cara's home asking for a meeting with her father. The young man was very serious and asked his beloved to talk about their upcoming marriage. On November 13, 2005, David Ludwig arrived at the Bordon residence for a talk with Michael, the father of his beloved Cara. He announced his love for Cara, their ongoing relationship, and their plans to marry. Michael's response was dismissive. "That will never happen." Anticipating such a response and coming prepared, David, fueled by rage, drew a handgun and shot Michael in the back as he was walking towards the front door. Then David sought out Cara's mother, Catherine, and shot her while she was sitting on a chair. David then searched for Cara in the house, calling out for her, but he couldn't find her. Afterwards, he got into his car and started to drive away when he saw Cara running down the road towards him. She got into the car and told David she wanted to go as far away as possible, get married, and start a new life. The young couple fled the city in the boy's red car. But why would a 14-year-old girl run away with a young man who had just shown such brutality? Wasn't she shocked and scared? Both were considered good kids. How did they turn into criminals? Cara Bordon was reported missing for 24 hours after her parents, Michael and Catherine Bordon, were found deceased. After reviewing surveillance footage, the police followed the trail of the teenagers. The footage also proved that Cara had not resisted but willingly accompanied David. Charges of abducting Cara were dropped against David Ludwig. Alerts were issued across the East as Pennsylvania and Indiana police investigated sightings of the couple heading west in a red Volkswagen Jetta. Authorities received a tip on Monday morning about a vehicle matching that description parked near a truck stop outside of Fort Wayne. Police headed to the area, but the car was gone. State police were alerted, and patrols spotted the car around noon on I-70 in Belleville. David Ludwig merged onto the interstate, leading them on a 5-mile chase at speeds of 90 to 95 miles per hour on a 2-lane highway. State Trooper David Cox, who was involved in the pursuit, described Ludwig as extremely reckless and dangerous at that moment, causing multiple accidents like in an action movie. The saga of the runaway lovers became a top national news story. Television broadcasts showed the capture of the teenage fugitives after the boy had ended the lives of his girlfriend's parents and took her with him. It turned out the lovers planned to escape far away, get married, and start a new life. The district attorney, commenting on the investigation, stated that the earlier abduction charge against the teenager would be dropped, but the charges for the demise of Michael and Catherine Bordon would remain. Ludwig and Cara fled together after the incident and were on the run from the authorities for about 28 hours before being apprehended in Indiana. Cara was not charged with any crime. David Ludwig was detained without bail on charges of ending lives and abduction. Cara Bordon was taken into the care of relatives and church members. David Ludwig was arrested on November 14, 2005 after a high-speed chase ended with his vehicle crashing into a tree. He was charged with the demise of the Bordons following a prolonged dispute. 14-year-old Cara Bordon faced no charges. On November 16th, David Ludwig was extradited back to Pennsylvania after waiving extradition. The failed Romeo confessed to 2 counts of intentional harm. It was a deliberate act. I intended to shoot them if they got in our way, and I did. During the search of the young man's vehicle upon his arrest, no weapons were found. But when police visited Ludwig's home, they discovered 54 firearms. This arsenal belonged to Ludwig's father, a hunter who taught his son how to handle weapons. An 18-minute video from a laptop in his home showed Ludwig discussing plans for an armed invasion of another family's home, showing him bringing weapons into the house. The court documents state they abandoned this plan due to too many cars present. The police declared Cara Bordon a victim in the case, yet Ludwig filed court documents claiming surveillance footage from various stores along their route would prove she was not abducted. Ludwig did not resist efforts to return him to Pennsylvania. A Pennsylvania judge ordered him held without bail. He was not represented by an attorney during the charge presentation. A preliminary hearing was set for November 23rd. The trial of the young individual responsible for ending 2 adult lives in front of their children was brief as detailed in court documents. Cara's 13-year-old sister, Caitlin, told investigators that her parents were shot after arguing with David for about an hour. According to court documents, Caitlin saw Ludwig shoot her father, then ran to the bathroom where she heard a second shot, presumably the one that took her mother's life. Ludwig then ran through the house calling for Cara, she told investigators. The couple's 9-year-old son ran to neighbors who called 911, reporting the tragic event. In June 2006, David Ludwig entered a plea agreement with District Attorney Ronald O'Brien, who had sought the death penalty as punishment. Thus, Ludwig pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree perpetrating among other charges and was immediately sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences of 9.5 to 19 years and was also ordered to pay $125,000 in restitution. Since 2006, Cara Bordon has been under guardianship, represented by a legal counsel. In written statements published on November 22, 2005, the abduction charge against David G. Ludwig was dropped. The court concluded that Cara Bordon left with Ludwig of her own free will. Ludwig's lawyer reportedly stated that Cara voluntarily accompanied David during their journey through 3 states, and surveillance recordings show that Bordon had ample opportunity to escape. Cara admitted that she ran after Ludwig as he left her house. Cara Bordon simply wished to marry her beloved, David Ludwig. Cara has been identified as a victim in this tragic situation and thus, The district attorney of Lancaster County did not levy any criminal charges against her. Her actions alongside Ludwig's during the investigation and the digital trail of emails, blogs, and texts they left behind contributed to this decision. At a solemn memorial service held at Lancaster Bible College, Cara Beth, amidst her siblings, mourned the loss of her parents. The Bordon family's neighborhood showed its respect and remembrance by adorning mailboxes with white ribbons. The loss left 5 children without the guidance and love of their parents. George Landis, an elder from the Monterey Chapel, reflected on the incident by saying that the purpose behind such loss is known only to God, reassuring that Mike and Katie are in a better place. Vera Zimmerman, 50, familiar with the Bordon family and Ludwig's mother for 7 years, remarked on the upbringing of the children, pointing out that a lapse in judgment led to the unfortunate events. Friends and neighbors recalled Cara Bordon as a joyful and sociable young girl, known for her babysitting in the neighborhood and her passion for soccer. Kevin Eshelman, executive pastor at Ephrata Community Church, noted her regular participation in youth group activities. However, underlying tensions between Cara and her parents were noted by Zimmerman, highlighting concerns over Cara's interest in boys. Samuel P. Lohr, a friend of Ludwig, disclosed to authorities their secret intimate relationship marked by flirtatious electronic communications and inappropriate image exchanges, according to legal documents. Zimmerman mentioned a significant decision by Cara's parents to disconnect her internet service in response to her relationship with David, indicating their disapproval. The peaceful town was left in shock by the grim events that unfolded, resonating beyond the local community to wider circles, especially those involved in homeschooling. Friends of the family struggled to comprehend how such sheltered children could commit acts of grave severity. Officially, they weren't considered a couple due to parental disapproval of their relationship, shared Stephanie Mammon, a 16-year-old neighbor of the Bordon family. This incident underscores the dilemma where David Ludwig, faced with opposition, chose violence as a solution to his problems. David G. Ludwig's appeal for release was ultimately denied by the state appellate court, as announced by the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office. Following his sentencing on June 20th, Ludwig underwent various assessments at Tampa Hill before being moved to a state prison in Indiana County to start serving his life sentence for taking the life of his girlfriend's parents. David Ludwig, at 19, was transferred on August 3rd to the State Correctional Institution at Pine Grove, announced by Susan Norton, spokesperson for the State Department of Corrections. The state chose the Indiana State Prison for Ludwig because of its youthful offender program. Designed for inmates aged 15 to 20, the program aims to teach self-responsibility, discipline, respect for others, and self-worth. According to the Department of Corrections, Pine Grove, opened in 2000, houses some of the state's most challenging young offenders in a therapeutic community setting. Inmates at Pine Grove start their day at 6:10 a.m. with a roll call, followed by a 6:30 a.m. workout session including squats, push-ups, and jogging in place. They return to their cells at 7:15 a.m. to get ready for breakfast at 7:30 a.m., with lunch at 11:30 and dinner at 4:20 p.m. The bulk of the day is filled with 4 hours of educational classes ranging from culinary arts, business, computer drafting, heating and cooling system installation, to building maintenance, and 4 hours of personal life management skills training. Inmates also participate in the 90-day military-style leadership development program fostering honor, discipline, honesty, and respect. Honor, discipline, honesty, and respect. Transitioning from the county jail, where Ludwig earned his high school diploma, to the state correctional facility was a challenge for the young man, stated Merrill M. Spann, one of Ludwig's attorneys. He will also be amongst young people from the general population and will be able to have visitors. The change was difficult because the county jail was smaller, and he had gotten used to the environment, Spann said. The cost of housing an inmate at Pine Grove, which employs about 430 people, is approximately $120 a day. Mr. Ludwig will be assigned jobs such as janitorial work or food service, and he will engage in daily recreational and educational activities, Norton stated. Inmates can earn between 18 to 42 cents an hour working as carpenters, plumbers, cooks, and laborers. The money earned can be used to purchase clothing, footwear, food, and personal items at the prison commissary. Most of the 250 inmates at Pine Grove stay until they turn 22, after which they are transferred to adult prisons to serve the remainder of their sentences. David Ludwig, now 37, is serving 2 consecutive life sentences for shooting Michael and Catherine Bordon in their home in November 2005 after they told him he could no longer see their 14-year-old daughter, Cara Bordon. In his latest petition, Ludwig referred to alleged issues, including being treated as a juvenile offender serving a life sentence. He cited the 2012 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, which found life imprisonment for juvenile offenders to be unconstitutional. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently denied the request, agreeing with Lancaster County Judge David Ashworth, who previously deemed the challenge untimely and unfounded, according to the county prosecutor's office. Ashworth stated that Ludwig does not deserve the same consideration as minors because he was 18½ at the time of the tragedies. David Ludwig is currently incarcerated in Luzerne County. Cara Beth Bordon, the 14-year-old girlfriend of 18-year-old David Ludwig, who is accused of ending the lives of the Bordon parents and fleeing with her to Indiana, has reunited with her family in Pennsylvania. However, as CBS News correspondent Sharon Alfonsi reports, it remains unclear what role Cara Bordon may have played in the incident. According to Alfonsi, the police now view Bordon as a victim. She has not been arrested, which leaves open the possibility that she played a significant role in the unfolding events. Given her age of 14, there's also speculation about potential charges against Ludwig for involvement with a minor. Warwick Police Chief Richard F. Garipoli Jr. told CBS News, "Cara is upset. She's crying. She's 14 years old, and it seems we forget that. She's devastated. This has completely changed the fabric of our community." A border neighbor involved in the memorial service told CBS News, "They were wonderful people, and we'll miss them terribly. It's complete madness, absolute madness," said the Lancaster County, Pennsylvania coroner G. Gary Kirchner. "This isn't a Romeo and Juliet deal. It's much worse." Thus, a decision made in a moment of fury and desperation took 3 lives. Why do we say 3 when there are 2 victims? Having received 2 life sentences, 18-year-old David Ludwig will live out his days in prison, never again to make a choice independently and never to be free again. But is that truly living? The community long remembered this terrible story and couldn't understand how such positive children could so casually commit such evil. Unfortunately, homeschooling didn't prevent this horrific tragedy. Growing up and being educated in a Christian environment didn't stop the cruel act. Perhaps the parents, trusting in God and faith, missed something crucial in raising their children or failed to convey the important lessons of Christian faith effectively. Maybe they weren't fulfilling their parental duties adequately, not having heartfelt conversations with their children, or trusting each other enough to prevent their daughter's secret escapes and stop the quest for new experiences. Perhaps it would have been better to allow the children to live without mentioning the Almighty, still sharing with their children the life they themselves had lived at a young age where there weren't so many restrictions and deprivations. Deciding for the children, parents eventually face disappointment from the decisions made later on. We can only speculate what might have prevented this tragedy. From all we've learned, one thing is clear. Violence always leads to more violence. When we're taught to live with violence, we become good as long as we're coerced and accepted as part of life. The more we practice, the more we endure and then use violence to solve our problems. Unfortunately, much of this acceptance of violence comes from Christian homes, but such violence is entirely against Christian teaching. Sadistic serial killer Michael Madison was born on October 15, 1977, just 2 weeks before Halloween, in Cleveland, Ohio. His parents, Diane Madison and John Baldwin, had an unplanned pregnancy and lacked a meaningful relationship at the time of his birth. Although John initially met with Diane to care for their son, he denied being Michael's father. Diane's own upbringing was marred by neglect, as her mother was a sex worker and heroin addict. This turbulent background left Diane ill-equipped to care for Michael independently. Shortly after his birth, social workers became involved due to concerns about the home environment. Diane allowed her numerous boyfriends to discipline Michael harshly, often resulting in severe abuse. When Michael was just 2 years old, Diane forcefully stuffed food down his throat, causing uncontrollable vomiting. In an attempt to quiet him, she placed him in a tub of hot water, which only made him cry louder. Frustrated, Diane removed him from the bath and beat him with an extension cord. By age 3, Michael was severely beaten with a belt by one of Diane's boyfriends, leaving him vomiting and requiring hospitalization. In another horrific incident, Michael was beaten so severely by another one of Diane's boyfriends that he lost hearing in one of his ears. After years of abuse, Michael was sent to live with his grandmother, who was still a heroin addict and sex worker. But unfortunately, Michael's horrific childhood wouldn't change. Michael continued to be hospitalized for reasons such as dehydration. The social workers involved in Michael's case would note that he and his half-brother were covered in scratches and bruises. Before Michael reached high school, he had become a familiar face to law enforcement. On several occasions, the teenager had been flouted using lemon. In high school, he received a delinquent charge for inappropriately touching another classmate. The crimes Michael committed as a teenager were nothing like the ones he would go on to commit as an adult. In July 2013, the family of 38-year-old Angela Deskins reported her missing after they haven't heard from her since June. Deskins was known for disappearing from time to time, so the family didn't think much of it. A month after she went missing, her body was discovered wrapped in electrical cords with a belt around her neck. 28-year-old Shatisha Sheely was reported missing in September 2012 when she didn't show up at her mother's house. Sheely, along with her 12-year-old daughter, were living with extended family at the time, and Sheely was supposed to stop by her mother's house to borrow some money, but she never showed. Her body was found in July 2013 inside a plastic garbage bag. After returning home from her job at an elementary school, 18-year-old Sherelda Terry disappeared. Her body was also found inside a black trash bag. On July 19, 2013, Michael's neighbors called the police to report a horrible smell coming from a garage near his second-floor apartment building. Inside the garage, the police discovered the decomposing body of a woman. During the police search of the surrounding area, including other vacant homes and backyards, the police found the bodies of 2 more women. Each was wrapped in plastic bags and located approximately 200 yards apart. The police were granted a search warrant for Michael's home, and inside, they found further evidence of decomposition. Now the search was on to find where Michael Madison was. The police tracked him down to his mother's house. When they arrived, Michael refused to come out, resulting in a several-hour alone standoff between him and the police before he finally agreed to come out and was taken into police custody. Michael never once showed remorse to the victims' families during the trial. Michael laughed, smiled in 20 of the families. During Sherelda Terry's father's victim impact statement, Michael smiled at the distraught father. This set Terry's father off, and he tried to attack Michael, but was quickly stopped. Michael didn't stop smiling once during the altercation. The jury deliberated less than a day before Michael Madison was found guilty of all 3 murders. He was also found guilty of 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapons possession by an ex-convict. On May 20, 2016, Michael was sentenced to death, a sentence he would attempt to appeal a month later. On July 21, 2020, the Ohio Supreme Court voted unanimously to uphold the death sentence for Michael Madison. Killer Ronald O'Brien. Children are cautioned from an early age not to accept candy from strangers. While this golden rule is strictly enforced by vigilant parents throughout the year, on Halloween night, they throw caution to the wind and allow their little ones to go door to door asking for treats. In most instances, their request is granted without worry. Even so, once in a while, the monsters that lurk in the shadows take advantage of the occasion, resulting in dire consequences for the most innocent among us. In 1974, a boy in Pasadena, Texas fell victim to just such a predator when he became violently ill after indulging in a treat from his Halloween bag. Ever the concerned parent, his father had stayed by his side during the hour-long ordeal, offering comfort to the youngster as he convulsed on the bathroom floor. Only 8 years old at the time, Timothy O'Brien died later that night on his way to the hospital. In a shocking turn of events, an autopsy revealed that he had ingested enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 grown men. As difficult as it was to believe, all signs pointed to the fact that someone had deliberately laced candy with a colorless compound before randomly handing it out to unsuspecting children. Investigators were convinced that a cold-blooded killer was hiding somewhere in the suburbs of Houston, and they intended to find him. With no suspects in mind and little evidence to go on, detectives theorized that an unscrupulous person who was angry at the world in general had decided to take the life of a complete stranger, a child no less, as a way of getting back at society. To make a difficult situation even worse, there was no telling how many children have received the tainted sweets. Although authorities had put out an emergency news bulletin requesting that all Halloween candy be brought to the police station for inspection, they feared that there would be other victims before all was said and done. While they faced an uphill battle to be sure, investigators did have a few things working in their favor. For one, it had been raining heavily on the evening of Trick or Treat, which had limited the number of houses that Timothy and his sister Elizabeth had visited. More importantly, a chemical analysis of the contents of the boys' tree bank had enabled them to pinpoint the carrier of the poison. Lab tests revealed that the killer's Weefa weapon of choice had been the sweet and sour powder contained inside of a straw-shaped pixie sticks. After meeting with the residents of the houses where the O'Brien children were known to have gotten candy, detectives were confident that none of them had given up pixie sticks. However, during the course of their interviews, they learned that someone had been witnessed doling out that particular treat and that someone had been Timothy's father, Ronald O'Brien. When he was brought in for questioning, O'Brien claimed that a man he had never seen before had emerged from a darkened home and given him several pixie sticks to hand out on his behalf. He added that after consuming a small amount of the sugary powder, Timothy had complained that it tasted funny. Instead of telling him to throw it out, he had given his son a soft drink to help wash it down. Under pretense of helping police solve the case, he had readily provided them with the address of the house where the exchange had taken place. Upon speaking with a mystery man, who turned out to be an air traffic controller named Clarky Melvin, officers learned that he had an alibi for the night in question. According to him, he had been at work and had not returned home until well after midnight. When they visited his place of employment, his supervisor confirmed his story and had the paperwork to prove it. In a stunning show of support, 200 of Melvin's co-workers came forward to vouch for his character. Realizing that they had been duped, investigators quickly concluded that this man was not their killer, something that Ronald O'Brien had known all along. A bit of digging into his past uncovered that Ronald O'Brien, who had trained as an optician, was not nearly as respectable as he wanted others to believe. "I'm not content who couldn't hold a job." He was drowning in a sea of debt. Not above taking what he wanted, he had been accused of stealing on numerous occasions, usually by former employers. While being shiftless and prone to theft doesn't necessarily mean that someone is capable of murder, the fact that O'Brien had taken out hefty life insurance policies, not one but 3, on his children in the months prior to his son's untimely death moved him to the top of the list of suspects. Another nail in O'Brien's self-constructed coffin came when it was discovered that he had phoned the insurance company on the morning after his son's death inquiring about a payout. As the 8-year-old's body lay in the icy morgue, his father's only concern had been how quickly the money he had coming would change hands. On November 5, 1974, less than a week after Timothy was poisoned, Ronald O'Brien was taken into custody and formally charged with 1 count of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. To no one's surprise, he pleaded not guilty across the board. He would steadfastly maintain his innocence throughout the trial despite the damning evidence against him. During the proceedings, a parade of witnesses testified that O'Brien had become fixated on the properties of cyanide in the months leading up to his son's murder. His obsession led him to brazenly ask friends and family alike if they knew where he could purchase the deadly poison. He would also inquire of them if they had any idea how much of the substance it would take to kill a person. In June of 1975, 8 months after little Timothy O'Brien had been laid to rest, his father was convicted of his murder. He was also found guilty in the attempted poisonings of the other 4 children, none of whom had ingested the lethal powder. For his crimes, Ronald O'Brien, whom the press had dubbed the Candyman, was condemned to the electric chair. Down the road, as alternative methods of execution were introduced, his punishment was amended to a more humane death by lethal injection. It had taken the jury just over an hour to decide the fate of the man who had so callously plotted and carry up the murder of someone who had trusted him implicitly. Once the verdict was in, the waiting game began. As it happened, 9 years would pass, more time than Timothy had spent on this earth, before his killer would face flannel justice. During his time on death row, O'Brien was reviled by his fellow inmates who, despite their own misdeeds, considered him to be lower than a snake's belly. Their hatred of the child killer ran so deep that they had thrown a party on the day of his demise to let him know that he would not be missed. After several stays of execution, O'Brien was put to death on March 31st, 1984 at the age of 39. When asked if he had any last words, he had taken the opportunity to rail against the system that had allowed him to come to such an end. When his death was announced over the loudspeaker, hundreds of people who had gathered outside the prison to celebrate the Atakian had shouted "trick or treat," while throwing handfuls of candy in the air in remembrance of Timothy, a young boy who had paid the ultimate price for his father's greed. Todd Allen Reed, the Forest Park Killer. The bodies of 3 women were found in the same stretch of parkland, all within a month of each other. It was not long before police had their man. But is he responsible for more than the 3 murders they convicted him for? 32-year-old Todd Allen Reed was already a registered sex offender when he strangled to death at least 3 women before dunking their naked bodies in Forest Park, a heavily wooded area just west of Portland, Oregon. From 1992 to 1995, he had served a measly 2.5 years of a 12-year sentence for the sexual assault of Shelley Harding, who was 7 months pregnant at the time of his cowardly attack. She had been walking home from work when he approached her and forced her into his car at knife point. Reese was involved to him and fled the scene of a minor crash with another vehicle on his way to the secluded spot where he sexually assaulted Shelley. After he had assaulted her, he attempted to strangle her with a seat belt and began to cry. Shelley was strong and she was calm. She had been talking to Ree constantly, like he was a friend, almost building a rapport. Whilst doing so, she made sure to leave as much physical evidence as she could, touching every surface to leave as many of her prints as possible. Whatever this monster was going to do to her, she wasn't going to make it easy for him to get away with. When Reed broke down, she used this to her advantage, and her pleas to be let go and her promises that she would not tell anyone worked. Reeve let her go. Not only did Shelley report her abduction and assault, the 2 men that had been in the car that Reed had crashed into also reported the hit and run. They even had his license plate. Reed pleaded no contest and was handed the 12-year sentence. He was registered as a sex offender, and, crucially, his DNA was taken and stored in the state crime lab. This would be the golden ticket police needed to catch the Forest Park serial killer 7 years later. Reed was released early as he had built up sentence-reducing credits, half of which were for good behavior. At roughly 8 miles long and 5,100 acres, Forest Park is one of the largest urban forest reserves in the USA, ranked 19th to be more precise. It is not easy to wander from the 70 miles of trails due to the park's dense vegetation. To highlight just how secluded this park can get, once you're off trail, in 2004, a 53-year-old man called Frank and his 12-year-old daughter Ruth were discovered to be living off-grid in the park. They had been there for 4 years, completely undetected. On May 7, 1999, a couple walking their dog on one of the park's more and more trails would come across the body of 28-year-old Wella Faye Mahler. She was naked and face down, entangled in thick blackberry brambles. She had been strangled, and it was determined that her body had been there for around 2 months. Police would find a used condom merely 28 feet from her body. They were able to extract DNA from this vital piece of evidence. The next day, May 8th, police themselves would discover a second body whilst they were searching the immediate area. The body of 26-year-old Stephanie Lynn Mussel was found around a quarter of a mile away from where Lila had been discovered. She too was found naked and had been strangled. Tests would determine she had been left there less than a week before she was found. They would also recover traces of DNA on her thighs. A group of hikers would find the third body, that of 18-year-old Alexandria Eisen, in the early evening of June 2nd. Alexandria had been reported missing sometime in May. Police were unable to reach her body until the next day due to the location. She'd been dumped down an extremely steep slope just off of a deer path. She was found naked and she too had been strangled. Her body was around 1/4 of a mile away from Loa and Stephanie's. After the discovery of Alexandria's body, Police Chief Charles Moves admitted that investigators had concluded they were looking for a serial killer due to the similarities of the crimes. Physically, all three women resembled each other, but they also had very similar life experiences. They were all homeless at the time of their deaths and had cocaine and heroin addictions, although Stephanie had just completed a detox program before her murder. Lila and Alexandria Vore had been at some point engaged in prostitution to pay for these addictions. All three women were known to frequent West Burnside Street. It's also been claimed that Lila and Stephanie knew each other, although this has not been proven either way. It was determined that all three of the women had been murdered elsewhere, and their bodies were taken to Forest Park afterwards. Toxicology all showed that they had taken heroin sometime before their deaths. The police response was immediate, and it was impressive. A specialist task force consisting of 16 individuals was formed, and they set about scouting bars, reaching out and offering protection to the community being targeted, and 30 additional beds were made available for homeless women during the investigation. Although residents were not happy about the lack of information they were receiving, the police kept their investigation tightly under wraps. Such was their determination to catch this killer. The task force would use the physical similarities of the three women to their advantage. A female officer of a similar appearance posed as a prostitute in West Burnside Street to see if they could reel the killer in. And sure enough, Ree took the bait. On the July 7th, the same day a vigil was being held for Lila, Stephanie, and Alexandria, Ree approached the undercover officer, and it was not long before his suspicious behavior flagged him to police. At about 5:20 a.m., he was approached by a member of the lookout team, Sergeant John Bachelet. Krieg readily admitted that he was a sex offender and agreed to a search of his vehicle. They found an unused condom, a book entitled The Killing Gift, about a woman who can kill men by merely looking at them, and some yellow strapping. There was nothing incriminating to be found, and the police had to let him go. He was not off the hook, however, far from it. Another lookout that night, Detective Sergeant Dave Schlegel, recognized him from the 1992 sexual assault case. He had in fact been the arresting officer. Police began 24-hour surveillance of Reed, both at his home and at his place of work. At least once during the surveillance, he was observed driving in circles around West Burnside and Sandy Boulevard. The police WAB results came back and confirmed that the DNA from the condom at the Mower crime scene and the DNA found on Stephanie's thighs matched the DNA that was on file for Todd Allen Reed. At around 7:30 p.m. on July 18th, after Reed had left for work, police executed a search warrant at his address where he lived with his girlfriend. Once the police had left the premises, his girlfriend phoned him to let him know the police had been there. He attempted to make a getaway in the middle of his shift, but it was too late. The police had already arrived. At 11:30 p.m. on July 18th, 11 days after police had questioned him and only 1.5 months after the task force was set up, Ray was arrested outside of Ranella Produce, the warehouse where he worked night shifts unloading the delivery trucks. On July 27th, he was indicted on 7 criminal counts in relation to 3 homicides. It emerged that Reed, who had been ordered to serve 8 years post-prison supervision and actually been kicked out of a sex offender treatment program 2 weeks before his arrest for failure to attend. On February 23, 2001, he pleaded guilty and received 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Ree had been facing the death penalty, but his plea deal took this off of the table. Reed is also the prime suspect in 2, possibly 3 other murders in the Portland area. The case is being referred to by Rees by the 1987 cold case murders of 15-year-old Jennifer Lynch Her and 12-year-old Mindy Colleen Thomas and the 1999 disappearance of 19-year-old Amma the Sains. In regards to the murders, Gresham Police Sergeant David Lerwick has been quoted as saying, "All we suspect that he was the person who killed both those girls. We didn't have enough evidence to convict him." Jennifer had gone missing on July 3, 1987, and her skeletal remains was found on July 8, 1988. Miggy went missing from the apartment complex where she lived on August 3, 1987, and her body was discovered on October 4, 1988. Both of the children had been strangled and dumped in wooded areas on the eastern side of Gresham, about 3 miles apart, and they were both last seen in the company of Gail Bennett, Reed's then girlfriend and later wife. They married in 1988 and divorced in 1997. Gresham police said Bennett, who has a police record of her own, might have information about the killings but has been uncooperative. Bennett has denied any knowledge. At the time, police were operating under the assumption that they had both been killed by the same man, and that this man was known to them. They had questioned Reed at the time of the investigation due to the fact they had both been seen with Gale, but he was never charged or arrested. Police renewed efforts to solve the Gresham cases after his arrest in the Portland killings, but attempts to compare DNA from the old crimes with Reed's DNA have been inconclusive. Alma, the witness seen on June 30th, 1999, has not been seen since. She was working as a prostitute at the time of her disappearance, and it has been claimed she knew / was friends with Alexandria Isson. No charges have been brought forward in her case, although it is impossible to downplay the likelihood they already had something to do with Amethyst's disappearance. As of June 2020, what prison Reed is in is not known. And as of June 2021, he was no longer listed as a new mate and may be dead. Larry Griffin was born in Waterford in 1880, the youngest of 6 children. In 1899, he enlisted in the Royal Artillery Regiment of the British Army, serving in India for 6 years before later fighting in France during World War I. After sustaining an injury that permanently impaired the use of one arm, he was discharged from the military. Upon returning to Ireland, Larry began working as a postman. His initial employment with the British Post Office was partly due to his status as a disabled veteran, but he continued delivering mail after Ireland gained independence and established its own postal service. In 1907, Larry married Mary, and the couple had 5 children. By 1929, however, only 3 of their children were still alive. The family resided in Kilmacthomas, where Larry collected mail each day before cycling 8 miles to Strad Valley to deliver it. On Christmas Day 1929, Larry attended morning mass and delivered gifts to his neighbor's children before starting his rounds. He told his son Jack and daughter Alice to wait for his return before heading to a Christmas dance, as he might have some extra coins for them. It was customary for postmen to receive tokens of appreciation on Christmas Day, such as coins, food, or drinks. Larry had meals with 2 different families in Strad Valley that day. By the time Larry visited local farmer John Cunningham after 5 p.m., he had clearly been offered plenty of alcohol, leading John to decide against giving him more. Larry was expected back home in Kilmacthomas between 8 and 9 p.m., but as the evening wore on, he did not arrive. Snow had begun falling around 7 p.m., and Mary Griffin initially hoped her husband had chosen to stay in Strad Valley for safety, knowing he was well-liked and could easily find a friend to host him for the night. Mary was not the only person waiting for Larry that night. Mr. Brown, the postmaster in Kilmacthomas, had been expecting Larry to report back after finishing work for the day. When he did not arrive, Mr. Brown went to the Griffin home, just after midnight, looking for him. When Mary informed him that Larry had never arrived home, Mr. Brown tried to assure her that Larry was fine. This did not diminish Mary's concerns, however, and she waited up all night hoping that her husband would come home. Mary Griffin's concerns were validated early in the morning of December 26th. At approximately 7:20 that morning, a man named David Connors was taking a walk on the road that connected Stroud Valley and Kilmacthomas. Some 2 miles out of Stroud Valley, he discovered a bicycle. The bicycle had seemingly been placed carefully in the road, facing in the direction of Kilmacthomas. David realized that the bike was a postman's bike because of the carrier on its handlebars that was used to hold a mailbag. The bicycle was the one by Larry Griffin. David notified the Gardaí stationed in Strad Valley of his discovery. The Gardaí initially assumed that Larry must have stumbled off while heavily intoxicated. However, by the time the afternoon came and Larry still had not been found, they began to fear that even if Larry had simply wandered off, some harm must have come to him after he did. Other postmen and friends of Larry began to search the area for him. It was another postman who first noticed that the scene where Larry's bicycle was found may have been staged. Several items, including a cycling cape, were folded up and tied onto the carrier that held the mailbag. Postmen did not typically tie their capes to their carriers like this because they had a tendency of flying up when the bicycle was in motion, when they were in such a position. Eventually, a witness who had passed the location where the bicycle was found earlier that morning came forward. At 4 a.m. on December 26th, the bicycle had not been there. After the initial smaller-scale searches failed to find Larry, additional resources were brought in. Gardaí were brought in from other stations in area, and a local priest implored the farmers in his congregation to search their land. Bogs were searched, and small bodies of water were dragged. 100 of civilian volunteers joined the search parties organized by the Gardaí, despite the strong rains that fell in the days following Larry's disappearance. Within a few days, nearly a 6-mile radius extending from where Larry's bicycle was found had been searched. Despite the extensive effort, Larry remained missing. Chief Superintendent Harry O'Mara, out of the Garda station in Waterford, had become involved in the investigation on December 27th. On January 6, 1930, he received a tip from a local priest that he needed to speak with a 16-year-old John Power. The following day, O'Mara interviewed John at the Strad Valley Garda station. John Power told Chief Superintendent O'Mara that he had been in Strad Valley Square, at an intersection known locally as Whalen's Corner, due to the fact that it was the location of Whalen's pub at 6 p.m. on Christmas Day with 3 other men. Around 6:30, Larry Griffin walked past him, but he was not alone. Larry was talking with Garda Edward DeLay, who was pushing Larry's bicycle for him. John believed that Larry was heavily intoxicated because he was leaning against Garda DeLay's shoulder and appeared to stop to try to vomit, just before he turned a corner. The 3 men who had been with John at the time were also brought in for interviews and confirmed John Power's story. Garda DeLay had previously reported that a witness had seen Larry Griffin on the road to Kilnack Thomas, a mile outside of town, which would imply that he had started his journey home, although other evidence suggested that he had not made it out of town. Garda DeLay was also adamant that the postman had been sober that night. He maintained that the postman was not drunk when Chief Superintendent O'Mara questioned him again after his interview with John Power. He did, however, acknowledge that he had seen Larry Griffin around 6:30 p.m., Christmas Day, outside of the post office. He claimed that he had not previously reported this interaction because he did not believe that it was important, even though it would have made him one of the last people to see Larry before he went missing. There were also other problems with Garda DeLay's account. He claimed that he and a very sober Larry Griffin walked and talked up to the first turn on the Kilmac Thomas Road, past the corner where the eyewitnesses had been standing. In contradiction to the eyewitness statements, he said that Larry had been pushing his bicycle himself. He also said that after walking with Larry up to his next turn on the road to Kill McDonough, he turned around and passed the 4 men at Whalen's Corner. He waited for about 5 minutes for Sissy Whalen, whom he was courting, to come out from her family's pub so that they could take a walk down to Strad Valley Cove. However, the 4 men had been at Whalen's Corner for another hour after seeing Larry and Garda DeLay, and none of them had seen him come back. Chief Superintendent O'Mara was losing confidence in the integrity of the members of the local Garda station, as irregularities between their statements and in their official records began piling up. His concerns grew even more when rumors surfaced that another Garda from Strad Valley, Garda William Murphy, had visited Larry O'Brien, one of the men who had been with John Power in Strad Valley Square on Christmas Day, and told him to keep quiet about what he had seen. Garda Murphy's records of his movements on the night of Christmas had him on patrol from 5 to 8:30 p.m. He claimed to have seen 2 specific individuals during this time, but both of those individuals said that this was false. Garda Murphy also said that he went immediately back to the barracks after his patrol, but the orderly at the barracks reported that he did not return until 10:30 and that he was in the company of Garda DeLay when he did. Garda Murphy and DeLay appeared to be hiding something, but their behavior did not necessarily indicate that they had done anything criminal. Both men frequented Whalen's pub, in part because they liked to drink and in part because Garda DeLay was courting Sissy Whalen and Garda Murphy was courting her sister Nora. They were a frequent source of trouble for their sergeant due to the amount of time they would spend at the pub while they were meant to be out on patrol. Their sergeant, Sergeant Cullinan, had in fact gone to Whalen's pub twice on Christmas night, not long before Larry Griffin had been seen outside of it. His first visit was to ensure that the Whalens were not serving alcohol that night, as it was illegal to sell or consume alcohol in a pub on Christmas Day or Good Friday at the time. The second visit was an effort to catch Garda Murphy and DeLay drinking there. As best as the authorities could determine, after piecing together all the shifting testimony, Larry Griffin finished his deliveries around 6 p.m. Then he and Garda Delay had visited another guard, Garda Patrick Frawley, a short time later. Garda Frawley lived in a flat above the post office, which was next to Whalen's pub. He did not include this visit in any of his formal statements or early interviews. Larry was visibly drunk when he arrived and had more to drink during the visit. The two guardie eventually took the postman outside and debated what to do with him since he would not be able to travel home in his state. Frawley walked to the pub to ask the Whalens if Larry could sleep there for the night, but Sergeant Conan saw him entering the pub from across the street and followed him in, thinking he would be catching some of his guards illegally drinking. Frawley, realizing he was being followed, therefore walked back out of the pub. He then warned Ailey that the sergeant was nearby on his way back to his home. Garda Ailey then walked Larry past John Power and his three friends. Later witness statements would show that after the two men turned the corner and disappeared from John Power's view, they had gone through the back gate behind Whalen's, meaning they most likely entered the pub through its back door. Whalen's pub clearly played some role in the story of what became of Larry Griffin, but how large that part was remained unclear. The pub was operated by Patrick Whalen and his wife Bridget. The establishment was not doing well in 1929. Patrick owed landlord and had been sued for not paying his suppliers. Patrick claimed to the guardie that he had not seen Larry on Christmas Day at all, and that Larry certainly had not been in the pub that evening. However, when three men from Kilnock Thomas had come to Strad Valley looking for Larry on December 26th, before the official investigation started, Patrick had told them that he had seen Larry and tried to convince him to sleep off his intoxication at his home, but Larry had refused. Patrick also denied illegally serving alcohol on Christmas Day. According to Patrick Whalen, no one outside of his family had been in the pub that night. Two witnesses, Ed Dunphy and Jack Galvin, did come forward saying that they had been drinking at the Whalens on Christmas Day, although they sat in the kitchen and did not see who was in the main section of the pub. They also said that Sissy Whalen was there that evening, contradicting Garda Delay's account of his movements. Sissy maintained that she had been with Delay, but when confronted with the witnesses who saw her at the pub that night, she claimed that she and Delay had been spending time in a shed behind the pub and that she would periodically go back inside so that her mother would not become suspicious of what they were up to alone. Circumstances made the Whalens look suspicious and seemed to place their pub at the center of the mystery of Larry Griffin's disappearance. However, the authorities did not get a full account of what may have happened to Strad Valley's postman inside of Whalen's pub on Christmas Day for almost a month. On January 23, 1930, police brought in 25-year-old Thomas Corbett, a local laborer, to ask him some questions. When he came to the station, he was accompanied by another man, James Fitzgerald. James was a bachelor twice Thomas's age, who had taken in Thomas and his pregnant wife after their marriage. While Thomas was giving his statement, James began chatting with Chief Superintendent O'Mara. According to O'Mara, James willingly volunteered a statement, although there would later be suspicions that James was interviewed more formally and deliberately. James Fitzgerald told O'Mara that he, Thomas Corbett, and two other friends had gone to Whalen's pub on Christmas Day, where alcohol was being served in spite of the law prohibiting this. He was being served in spite of the law prohibiting this. He and Thomas had seen Garda Frawley and Sergeant Cullinan walking away from the pub and felt safe to enter the pub through the back entrance around 6:30 p.m., knowing that the sergeant was headed away from the establishment. They had drinks in the kitchen and chatted with Bridget Whalen. According to James, in addition to the group in the kitchen, there was also a large number of people in the main room of the pub. At some point during the evening, an intoxicated Larry Griffin had dropped 3 coins. The local gravedigger, Ned Morrissey, picked them up and used them to buy drinks. Larry and Ned got into an argument which turned into a scuffle. Ned put his leg out and tripped Larry. On his way down to the floor, Larry hit his head on a stove. Larry was not moving, but Ned turned him over onto his back and told him to get up. Larry did not answer. The rest of the people in the pub quickly realized that Larry was dead. Patrick Whalen yelled at Ned Morrissey, telling him that he had ruined him by killing a man in his house and tried to attack him. The commotion brought everyone in the building out by the bar. Ned promised Patrick that everything would be all right if they just disposed of Larry's body, thereby getting rid of any evidence that something had happened to Larry, much less at Whalen's pub. One of the other men at the pub that night was Thomas Cashin, the principal at a nearby national school. He owned the only car in the village and used it to drive Gardy, Delay and Murphy around on December 26th as a part of search for Larry Griffin. According to James Fitzgerald, he had used that car on December 25th as a part of the plot to dispose of the body of Larry Griffin. Ned Morrissey, Patrick Whalen, Thomas Cashin, and another man who had been in the pub, George Cummins, placed Larry's body, which had been wrapped in a white blanket, in Thomas's vehicle. Thomas then drove off with Ned Morrissey in his passenger seat. According to James, there was some debate about where exactly to dispose of the body, but he believed they settled on an abandoned copper mine in the area. Garda Delay took Larry's bicycle and promised to abandon it along the road. Garnet Murphy left with him and the bicycle. While James Fitzgerald was giving this detailed account of Larry Griffin's death, Thomas Corbett was providing an entirely different story about how they had spent Christmas evening. He also said that he and James had gone to Whalen's, but they had not been led inside. They then instead went to another pub and then to a card game where Thomas got into a fist fight. Like so many of the other statements given to the Gardaí in this case, only some parts of this version of events could be corroborated by other eyewitness testimony. The two other men James had claimed had gone to Whalen's with him denied being there. The Gardaí were convinced by James' account, however, because he had implicated so many important members of his community. James was afraid to remain in Strad Valley. The Gardaí took him home in the middle of the night to collect some of his clothing, and he was then taken to the city of Waterford, where he was held as a protected witness. Based on James' statement, the Gardaí arrested Thomas Cashin and Ned Morrissey the following morning. They were taken to court and charged with the murder of Larry Griffin, disposing of his body to prevent or obstruct a coroner's inquest, and stealing his post bag and postman's hat, which were legally the property of the Postmaster General. 2 days later, Patrick Whalen and two other men James had implicated in his statement, George Cummins and Patrick Cunningham, were also arrested. Bridget Whalen, her daughter Nora and son Jack were then also arrested. Sissy Whalen and the Whalens' youngest son were the only two members of the family not charged in connection with the case. Gardaí, Delay and Murphy were also arrested on February 3rd, bringing the total number of accused up to 10. On February 7th, the first preliminary hearing in the case was held at the Waterford courthouse. The prosecution's first and most important witness was James Fitzgerald. When asked to provide an account of his actions on Christmas Day, his testimony started out in line with the statement he had provided in Strad Valley. However, it then changed dramatically. James testified that he had gone to Whalen's and gotten a drink, but it had been handed out to him, and he and his companions had never gone inside. His new account was more in line with the one Thomas Corbett had provided. He now said that they went to a different pub and then to play cards. The prosecution was obviously shocked by James' sudden about-face. They had interviewed him just that morning, and at that time he was still standing by his original statement. He had made only one change to it, although it was a major one. He now claimed that Larry Griffin had still been breathing when he was wrapped in the blanket and taken from Whalen's pub, which would have made the case definitively one of murder. Prosecuting barrister Finley questioned James heavily about his earlier statement, but James now insisted that most of the statement was false. Having lost this important testimony, Finley requested a week-long remand and was granted one. The 10 accused men and women were ordered to remain in custody during that time. The prosecution's main goal during the remand period was to find Larry Griffin's body. Without James Fitzgerald's testimony, the body was absolutely essential for them to make a case. The abandoned copper mines in the area were being searched in hopes that James Fitzgerald's original statement could still be relied upon and that Morrissey and Cashin had planned to dispose of him there. Working only at night, a team of Gardaí also dug up 24 recent graves in 6 area graveyards to make sure that Larry had not been buried alongside their intended occupants. Bodies of water and local farms were searched. Still, Larry's body could not be found. At the hearing on February 14th, the prosecution had to rely on witnesses whose testimony provided only circumstantial or inexact evidence against the 10 defendants. Witnesses testified about the changes some of the defendants had made in the accounts they provided about what they did on Christmas Day, and a doctor provided testimony about some alleged bloodstains that had been found on the Whalen property. But the technology available at the time meant that his examination of the evidence could definitively say very little about it. The prosecution was given another week to build their case, and then another one following that hearing on February 21st. At a hearing on March 1st, Finley had no evidence to present but argued that he had reason to believe that Larry Griffin's body would be located very soon and was given one more remand. On March 7th, Finley conceded that further inquiries into the case would be required in the absence of Larry's body and the evidence he believed it would provide. He asked that all charges be withdrawn while those inquiries were undertaken. All 10 defendants were released from custody. No further charges have ever been filed in the case, and Larry Griffin's body has never been found. It would be easy to blame James Fitzgerald for the collapse of the prosecution's case and a lack of justice for Larry Griffin, but his later statements indicate that he may have been right not to testify to his original statement, even though it may have been an accurate account of what happened to Larry on Christmas evening. Following the dismissal of the charges against the 10 defendants, James became concerned for his safety. He claimed that he received multiple threats, and he was unable to find work as a result of his role in the case. James promised to tell the new head of the investigation, Superintendent James Hunt, everything he knew once he was safely away from Strad Valley. Superintendent Hunt was able to get a job for him with a farmer in Galway, and James Fitzgerald left Strad Valley on March 14, 1930. 2 days later, James met with Superintendent Hunt and spent 2 days explaining what he actually knew and how he came to know it. This account combined many details of his initial statement, the statement he made in court, and statements of other eyewitnesses. James now said that he went to Whalen's pub sometime after 7:30 p.m., but before 8 o'clock and drank a stout in the kitchen. Around 8, he saw Larry Griffin and Garda DeLay walking through a hallway, presumably going out to the yard. Shortly thereafter, he saw them walk back in on their way back towards the main room of the pub. James now claimed that this was the last time he saw Larry, alive or dead. Around 8:20, James went outside of the pub where he and Thomas Corbett, Patrick Cunningham, and Jim Murphy spent time until approximately 9 o'clock, being served drinks by Sissy Whalen through the pub's hall door. Then, as Thomas Corbett had told the Gardaí, they went to another pub and then to a card game where Thomas got into a fight around 11 p.m. After the fight was broken up, James, Thomas, and Patrick all left the hall where the card game was being played. James and Thomas, who lived in the same house, went in one direction to get home, and Patrick Cunningham went in another. James went to bed as soon as he made it home. Patrick Cunningham, however, apparently did not go straight home. James now claimed that he had heard about Larry Griffin's accidental death from Thomas Corbett. Thomas had heard about it from Patrick, who was his employer. Patrick had stopped into Whalen's before going home, where he witnessed the argument and Larry's death, sometime around 11:30. James said that while the details about how Larry died came from Patrick Cunningham via Thomas Corbett, the details about the disposal of the body and the mines came from other sources around town in the days after Larry's disappearance. He claimed that the only detail in his original statement that he outright made up was the white blanket he originally said Larry's body had been wrapped in. It is possible that James was relaying the actual truth about what became of Larry Griffin in his original statement to Chief Superintendent O'Mara, but that truth was not his to testify to. While we have a believable account of what may have happened to Larry Griffin on Christmas evening of 1929, his case still remains unsolved as this account has not been verified. The investigation was full of local gossip, conflicting accounts, and reasons for people to be dishonest. However, the idea of an intoxicated Larry accidentally dying on Christmas Day and his body secretly being disposed of to avoid a scandal does keep resurfacing in this case. If Larry did accidentally die in Whelan's pub, there would be plenty of reasons to conceal it. Even if Larry's death was accidental, it would have revealed illegal activity and had serious repercussions for many of the people who witnessed it. The Whalens would have faced legal actions for illegally serving alcohol on Christmas Day and, given their precarious financial situation at the time, would have most likely lost everything they had. The two members of the Gardaí would have faced suspension, reassignment, or dismissal. Thomas Cashin was in ongoing trouble with the Department of Education for his lack of an Irish language qualification and his multiple failures of the exam to acquire one. Being tied to illegal drinking on Christmas Day alone could have potentially put his job in jeopardy, and the scandal of being affiliated with a man's death would make his dismissal much more likely. While Larry was not murdered, there was also no guarantee that manslaughter charges would not be brought against the other people at the pub that night. All these factors being considered, the idea that Larry's body was secretly disposed of to avoid problems for whoever witnessed his death seems plausible, even though many of the parties rumored to be responsible for this action would have been Larry's friends and prominent members of his community. That all being said, even if we accept the idea that Larry somehow died accidentally on the last night he was seen, we still cannot be sure of the circumstances, as the story of him dying at Whalen's pub was third-hand information by the time it reached the Gardaí. There were also rumors in town that Larry had died at the Strad Valley Garda Barracks and allegations that it was really the more influential Thomas Cashin rather than lowly laborer Ned Morrissey who had the fight with Larry that resulted in his death. Most of these questions will never be answered, and if anyone deserved to be jailed for Larry's death, they cannot be brought to justice now, as they have all since passed away. The one remaining mystery that can definitively be solved, and is, I would argue, the most important one, is what became of Larry Griffin's body. Being unable to provide her husband with a Christian burial was a source of great distress for Larry's widow, Mary. She held on to the hope that she would find his body up until her own death in 1958. Larry is memorialized on her tombstone with his presumed date of death on Christmas Day of 1929. Today, the task of locating Larry's body so that he can finally be laid to rest alongside his wife has been taken up by his grandchildren. Lawsuits for libel were filed against various newspapers that reported on the case by various individuals involved in it until well into the 1970s. Efforts to write about the case were also hindered by a lack of access to the Gardaí's official files. As such, there was relatively little published about this case, which had attracted national attention for many years. Because the case was unresolved, the files from the official Garda investigation were not publicly released, but they remained kept from the public long after the deaths of the direct participants in the case. In 2009, an RTE television program covered the case and questioned why these files had not been made public. In response to the public pressure, the Gardaí made many of these files available. Fachtno O'Driscoll, who had worked on the RTE program, used these files to write his 2011 book on the case. The publicity generated by the release of the book, as well as the ongoing efforts of Larry Griffin's grandchildren, resulted in new efforts to solve the mystery more 80 years after Larry Griffin's disappearance. It was long rumored in the Strad Valley area that Larry had been buried under a road that was being worked on around Christmas of 1929 in the nearby town of Valley Boyle. Larry's grandson, Seamus Mornan, was able to locate a county council document that confirmed that the road was being worked on at the time of his grandfather's disappearance. In September 2012, Larry's family and Fachtno O'Driscoll were able to arrange for radar and specialized equipment to be brought in to search for Larry's remains under the road. Unfortunately, the effort did not find Larry's remains. 90 years after Larry Griffin's disappearance on Christmas Day, his case is still plagued by rumor and debate. Luckily for Larry, there is more to his legacy than the mystery he left behind. The love his wife and children had for him has inspired his grandchildren to continue to search for his remains. Hopefully, they will one day be able to finally fulfill the multi-generational wish for Larry to receive a Christian burial. 40 years ago, an American teenager was discovered bludgeoned to death in a cemetery in New Jersey. Her injuries were so severe that identifying her was impossible at the time. The American public dubbed her Princess Doe, a Jane Doe who had tragically died too young. For decades, her real identity remained a mystery, until now. Hi and welcome to Mysterious 7. I'm Michael, and in today's episode, I'll walk you through the heartbreaking story of Princess Doe, how she was killed, how her identity was uncovered, and how her killer was finally brought to justice. Princess Doe was an unidentified teenager from West Babylon, New York. Her body was found on July 15, 1982, in Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. Her face had been bludgeoned beyond recognition. Her case gained national attention, and the public took a special interest in unraveling her story and finding answers. She became the first unidentified dead body to be entered into the National Crime Information Center. On the morning of Thursday, July 15, 1982, at around 8 a.m., gravedigger George Keese discovered the body of a young girl in the rear section of the Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. The body was found lying on its back just over a steep bank that leads to a creek below. The victim's face had been beaten beyond recognition with a yet-to-be-determined object. Due to the significant decomposition of her body, even her eye color could not be confirmed. The young girl was dressed in a red short-sleeve shirt. A peasant-style skirt was found lying on top of the victim's legs. No footwear or undergarments were found. No conclusive evidence all was found, but this was difficult to determine because of how much the body was decayed. A golden cross necklace was found tangled in the victim's hair. 2 earrings were found in her left ear. Red nail polish was found on the right hand only, and she had no surgical scars, distinct birthmarks, or tattoos. Scars or marks on the head or face area could not be known due to the condition of the body. Forensic anthropologists determined that the victim was not pregnant and had never given birth and was most likely between the ages of 18 and 14 years old at the time of her death. Toxicology did not reveal any traces of drugs, but was not entirely conclusive because of the time elapsed between the death and the discovery of the body. It is believed that the body was discovered after 2 to 3 days or possibly even weeks of exposure to the elements. This was especially difficult to determine because of the hot and humid weather in the area at that time. The forensic examination indicated that the girl had attempted to fight back or defend herself from her attacker, as injuries indicating trauma to her hands and arms were visible. The girl's body was buried in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, not far from where she was discovered in January 1983. Donated funds were used to pay for the victim's coffin and headstone. The headstone was engraved with the text, "Princess Doe, missing from home, dead among strangers, remembered by all." For many years, Princess Doe was thought to be Diane Janiskai, a missing teenager from San Jose, California who vanished on July 30, 1979. This theory was propagated by several law enforcement officials in the state of New Jersey, who went as far as to hold a press conference identifying Diane Guy as Princess Doe. However, Lieutenant Eric Krantz, the Princess Doe case's original lead investigator, maintained that Diane Guy was not a viable candidate for Princess Doe's identity. Krantz's feelings were shared by Diane's family and investigators in California who were particularly angered by the conduct of the New Jersey law enforcement. In 2003, Princess Doe's DNA was compared with a DNA sample from Diane's mother, Patricia, and it was conclusively determined that Princess Doe was not Diane Guy. After seeing images of the girl's clothing in the newspaper, a witness named Anne-Marie Latimer reported to officials that she remembered seeing a girl wearing the same clothing as Princess Doe purchasing cigarettes on July 13, 1982, just 2 days before her body was found. Latimer stated that she was shopping with her daughter at a supermarket across from the cemetery and observed and was able to describe the victim's clothing. The shirt and skirt themselves were traced to a manufacturer in the Midwestern United States, although the brand labels were missing. 3 people reported after viewing the photos that they had bought similar clothes at a Long Island store, which is now closed. On September 22, 1999, the body of Princess Doe was exhumed from the Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown so that DNA samples could be taken. The body was reburied in the same location. After a 2012 photo composite of the victim was released, it generated new tips as it resembled several missing girls from across the country. One theory was submitted that Princess Stone may have been a runaway and could have been an individual using false names while employed at a hotel in Ocean City, Maryland. In 2012, a sample of her hair and a tooth were examined through isotope analysis and indicated that the victim was most likely born in the United States, at least 7 to 10 months in the Midwestern or Northeastern United States. The tooth sample indicated she could be from Arizona. It is also believed that the girl had spent a long time in Long Island, New York. Lieutenant Krantz, now retired, coined the name Princess Doe early in the investigations and also managed to get the case covered extensively in the media. The case was used as the impetus for recording unidentified crime victims in the MCIC database at the national level. Princess Doe became the first such case entered by the FBI director. After extensive print media coverage in 1982, Lieutenant Krams, who was the original lead investigator from the Blairstown Police Department, was contacted by HBO regarding the Princess Doe case and asked if the channel could chronicle the case in an upcoming documentary entitled Missing. Krantz agreed, and the segment was filmed over several weeks. Krantz was shown following leads as they came in. The documentary featured actual footage of the recovery of Princess Doe's body, along with footage shot by HBO of Princess Doe's 1983 funeral. The case was also featured on America's Most Wanted in 2012 in hopes of generating new information about the case. The same year, the most recent reconstruction was broadcast on CNN. On July 15, 2012, a memorial service was held for the 30th anniversary of Princess Doe being discovered at the top of the ravine where her remains were found. Over 100 citizens attended, as well as several reporters and cameras. The victim's clothing as well as her photo reconstructions were on display for public viewing. On October 12, 2014, Princess Doe was honored at a missing persons rally in the area. In the years between the first discovery in the body and the final identification, several theories cropped up. The first one was that Princess Doe was actually Diane Dye, a young girl missing from California, which has now been definitively disproved. Secondly, the killer of Princess Doe was already imprisoned for another homicide. A man called John Rees was briefly suspected as he was convicted of killing another woman in nearby Belvedere, New Jersey, but there was no real evidence of a connection with Princess Doe. The third theory was that Princess Doe was either a runaway that was known to work in the Ocean City, Maryland area, or a prostitute who worked at the local truck stop. The information for these two possibilities was highly inconclusive. Nobody from the local area came forward to identify Princess Doe on or off the record. It seems unlikely that not one single person would come forward if she was known in the area. The fourth and disturbing theory was that Princess Doe was killed by a Blairstown police officer, and that is why the case was never solved. But this claim is completely unsubstantiated. There are retired local law enforcement officers who still follow and contribute to the case even after 40 years. The fifth theory was that Princess Doe was a victim of a serial killer known to operate in the area, such as John Kleiss, Henry Lee Lucas, or Joel Rifkin. Though local law enforcement was aware of these claims, none were found to be credible. A sixth theory was that Princess Doe was an out-of-state teenager who worked at an area camp. Again, this was never proven. And now we come to the seventh theory, that Princess Doe was killed by a man named Arthur Kinlaw. For many years, this was the most current theory. Many of the facts fit the case, and this theory was explored on the America's Most Wanted website. Several New York Newsday articles reference this theory that was published in 1999 and 2000. Mr. Kinlaw was already imprisoned for other crimes. But since Princess Doe's body wasn't identified, his involvement in her murder could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Princess Doe's body was re-exhumed in November 2020 using a grant, and she underwent DNA extraction for genetic genealogy. In May 2021, investigators were notified by the NCMEC, or National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who were collaborating with Astria Forensics about obtaining DNA markers from degraded samples of Princess Doe's body using a grant. On June 18, 2021, investigators received the news that Astria Forensics agreed to extract DNA and construct a DNA profile. On February 10, 2022, Astria Forensics relayed to investigators that the creation of a DNA data file was successful. The results were sent to the NCMEC's consulting genealogist from Innovative Forensics Investigations. The managing officer was Jennifer Moore, who agreed to perform unlimited genealogy testing free of charge. On February 22, 2022, Innovative Forensics announced to investigators that they had found a candidate for Princess Doe. Investigators went to West Battle on New York, where they met Robert Olenek Jr., Princess Doe's brother. They also collected a DNA sample from Princess Doe's sister, which mitotyping technology used to build a mitochondrial DNA profile. The Union County Prosecutor's Office Forensic Laboratory assisted by creating an STR DNA profile through the victim's sister's DNA sample. Mitotyping technology sent their results to the Union County Prosecutor's Office Forensic Laboratory, then sent both the mitochondrial DNA and strDNA profiles to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. On April 29, 2022, the center identified Princess Du as Dawn Olenek. Her identity was formally announced on July 15, 2022, the 40th anniversary of her discovery. Robert Olenek Jr. said that Olenek left their home at her mother's request, and she was never seen or heard from again. Way back in 1999, evidence came to light that Arthur and Donna Kinlaw may have been involved in Princess Doe's murder. Donna was arrested in California for attempting to commit welfare fraud by using the name Eliana, which was traced to a Long Island native. When the police questioned her, she gave them details about the murder of Linda, and her testimony put the Kinlaws behind bars. Donna gave details about 2 murders Arthur had committed of 2 other female victims who remain unidentified today. After Arthur was faced with a death sentence, Donna told authorities that Kinlaw had killed another woman, a sex worker, earlier in 1982. She told police that she was with Arthur in the cemetery and witnessed him commit the murder. Another report states that Donna Kinlaw said that in July 1982, her husband brought home a teenage girl, left home, and returned without her. He later apparently disposed of his clothing and cleaned his vehicle. Afterward, he threatened his wife, claiming if she did not attend her job, he would take her life as he did to the girl he brought home. However, a lack of cooperation meant that Arthur Kinlaw was not charged. Lieutenant Stephen Spears, who worked on the case as a member of the Warren County Prosecutor's Office, from which he is now retired, stated that Kinlaw claimed responsibility for her death, but I have no physical evidence to confirm that. And without the identity of Princess Du, I have no way of connecting the dots, so to speak, putting her in a place where he could have been or would have been at the same time. Spears also reported that he doubted the confession because the Kinlaws could not provide a name for Princess Du, even though they claimed to have been with her for some time. Even though he questioned the credibility of their statements, Spears does not believe the victim was native to Long Island, New York. However, Donna Kinlaw was interviewed by a forensic artist who created a sketch of the girl she claimed to have met, which does resemble the most recent composite. Arthur Kinlaw remained incarcerated for 2 counts of second-degree murder. Following the 2022 investigation of Princess Du as Dawn Olenek, Arthur Kinlaw was reconsidered as a suspect and later charged with Olenek's murder. Dawn Olenek was born on August 5, 1964. She had been a junior at Connecote High School in Bohemia, New York, where she had lived with her mother and sister, authorities said, but she soon moved out of the family home. According to her brother, she was thrown out of her home by her mom. She ended up getting killed in a cemetery, leaving no clue as to her real identity. But for more than 20 years, the name of her suspected killer was no secret. In 1999, the wife of Arthur Kinlaw, the convicted pimp who today is serving time for the murder of many other Long Island women, tied her husband not only to those deaths, but to the brutal slaying of the girl in the Blairstown Cemetery. In an interview with Newsday at the time, Donna Kinlaw recounted how her husband in the summer of 1982 brought a girl of about 18 years old back to their Central Islip home. She told the newspaper as well as police that her husband left with the woman, but later returned home alone, appearing shaken. About 2 weeks later, according to Newsday, she read that police in Belvedere, New Jersey had found the body of a dead girl who fit the description of the girl who was in their house that night. He kept saying, "What does it say? What does it say? Does it say who the person was who got killed?" She said her husband asked. From the story she read aloud to her husband, Donna Kinlaw told Newsday that she remembered that the New Jersey police named the dead girl Princess Jane Doe. Not long afterward, investigators exhumed her body to recover the murder victim's femur bone in hopes of using her DNA to identify her. And in fact, investigators acknowledged that Arthur Kinlaw confessed to the New Jersey murder in written statements dating back to 2005. But it was not until April of this year that Dawn Olenek was positively identified. Arthur Kinlaw, now 68, is currently imprisoned in Sullivan County, New York on 2 other first-degree murder convictions from 2000. Among them was a teenager he knew only as Linda in April 1984 in the Bronx, Newsday reported. "I strangled her with my hand," said Kinlaw. She was hit about the head by me with a bat. Arthur Kinlaw has now been charged with 1 count of homicide as the result of the subsequent investigation, witness statements, and his confession of Olenik's murder. It is believed that after Don Olenik refused his demands to go into prostitution, he drove her to New Jersey. They both ended up in Blairstown, where Kinlaw murdered her in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery. Neither Olenek nor Kinlaw had a connection with the town. Kinlaw remains imprisoned at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. Investigators are now looking to piece together Don Olenik's movements in the time leading up to her death. The DNA Doe Project, also DNA Doe Project Incorporated or DDP, is an American non-profit volunteer organization formed to identify unidentified deceased persons, more commonly known as John or Jane Doe, by using forensic genealogy. Their volunteers identified victims of automobile accidents, homicides, and unusual circumstances, such as persons who committed suicide under an alias. The group was founded in 2017 by Colleen Fitzpatrick and Margaret Press. Unraveling the mystery of Princess Doe has been a sensational success for genealogical DNA testing of exactly this kind. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest impact, and for the case of Princess Doe, that was exactly what happened. A molar root weighing just 200 kilograms would hold the answers that had eluded investigators for close to 40 years. With the help of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Princess Doe's molar and eyelash were submitted to Astria Forensics in 2021 for possible DNA extraction. What is so special about Astria is that they can extract DNA from samples that are degraded or otherwise would provide no value, said Carol Schweitzer, a forensic supervisor at NCMEC. We knew that if anyone could get the information that was needed, Astria could, and they did. Kelly Kincaid, CEO of Astria Forensics, told NCMEC that they were lucky to find that the DNA was exceptionally well preserved and allowed for millions of pieces of information to be gathered to complete a DNA profile. This single DNA extract contained 100 of millions of unique human DNA fragments, said Kelly. With these sequencing data, we were able to reconstruct her whole genome single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNP profile. This resulted in Astria being able to deliver genotype files to NCMEC and the Warren County Prosecutor's Office that could go on and be used to complete Princess Doe's genealogy. This technology, that would not have been possible 40 years ago, was just the break the investigators had been hoping for to identify Princess Doe's identity. Once Astria finished the sequencing, Innovative Forensic Investigations, or IFI, started to work on investigative genetic genealogy techniques to build a family tree that would ultimately lead to the true identity of Princess Doe, or who we now know as Don Olenik. This work was only possible because of the collaborative effort of each agency, said Jennifer Moore, CEO of IFI. Our team brings forward a diverse set of skills that allows us to help find answers to cases. Echoing Moore's sentiment in today's press conference, Prosecutor Pfeiffer reiterated that science and technology made the impossible possible in this case. Don's case was deeply personal for the investigators involved, and their push for answers and justice never wavered. Don's family expressed deep gratitude to everyone who worked to find answers in Don's case. "This is a very big deal for my family," said Don's cousin. "I'd like to thank Blair Stant for treating my cousin like she was one of their own. Touches our family deeply. My cousin is always in my heart," he said while tapping the photo of Don pinned to his chest. "Blairstown, David Terwona gave up, and we were greatly appreciative of that." Since Princess Doe was the first unidentified persons case to be entered into NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, by the director of the FBI, William Webster, on June 30, 1983, this was a historic moment for missing and unidentified persons that has continued to play a crucial role in investigations since. The entry in NCIC has remained current and alive until today, when she will be removed. The tenacity of law enforcement has never stopped, and they continue to pour resources and new technology into solving this case. And it's thanks to the collaboration between police authorities and genealogical DNA testing experts that Princess Doe was publicly identified on the 40th anniversary of the discovery of her body as Dawn Olenek. So what do you guys think about this 40-year-old case finally getting resolved? Do you still have any theories about Princess Doe? Let us know in the comments section. In the early hours of July 7, 1985, 54-year-old Jane Anchor Hilton was found brutally beaten and stabbed to death in a bedroom at her employer's home, a place she had moved into just the day before to escape a troubled marriage. Jane's body was discovered by 2 housemates and her daughter, Autumn. The murder seemed inexplicable, and the case languished for 14 years until 2 detectives reopened the cold case in 1999. A misquote in an article eventually led investigators to suspect Ricky Davis. Davis was tried, convicted, and sentenced, though he steadfastly maintained his innocence. Refusing to give up, he sought help from the same justice system that had imprisoned him. 15 years later, Davis was exonerated when genetic genealogy testing identified the real killer. His freedom was secured thanks to the efforts of the Innocence Project, a group committed to uncovering the truth. Jane was a well-known figure in El Dorado Hills, California. She was a columnist for the Foothill Times, frequently covering local social events. A devoted mother to her 6 children, Jane often wrote poetry to inspire them and was working toward obtaining her real estate license. Married to Archie Hilton in 1984, her marriage began to unravel by mid-1985. Seeking refuge, Jane turned to her employer, Wilma Klein, for help. Klein owned a fairly large home in El Dorado Hills. With her lived her daughter, Maureen Klein, and her boyfriend. Wilma's grandson Ricky Davis and his girlfriend Connie Dahl also occupied a room at the house. On July 6, 1985, Wilma welcomed Jane and her youngest daughter, 13-year-old Autumn Anchor, into her home. By all accounts, it was a full house. The first night of her new life would prove to be the night her life ended. At 3:30 a.m., Ricky Davis, then 20, and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Connie Dahl, returned from a party to find Autumn lingering about outside. She told them she was out late and afraid her mother was going to be angry. All 3 made their way into the house. There was blood in the hallway. It was silent as they reached the first room, belonging to Maureen, Ricky's mother. On the bed was the bloody body of Jane Hilton. She was not breathing. Maureen and her boyfriend had gone on a camping trip and were not home at the time. Ricky and Connie called 911. Paramedics and police arrived, but Jane was pronounced dead at the scene. She had suffered 29 stab wounds, was beaten and bitten on her shoulder. It was a senseless murder, and investigators began to interview those closest to Jane. Archie Hilton, Jane's estranged husband, was interviewed and provided detectives with a solid alibi and DNA. Archie had been the logical choice as he and Jane had been going through a rough patch. He, however, said that the marriage was not over and that there was no trouble between them. He was cleared and all leaves went cold. Ricky Davis and Connie Dahl both told investigators they arrived home in the early morning hours and found Autumn waiting outside. When they entered the house, they found the hallway carpet bloody. The blood trail led them to the master bedroom where they found Jane lying dead on the bloodied mattress. They speculated that an intruder may have been responsible for the murder. For 14 years, the case remained unsolved. The cold case reopened in 1999. El Dorado County Sheriff's detectives Richard Strasser and Rick Fitzgerald retest with the investigation. After poring over paperwork, they zoomed in on a news article. Connie Dahl, former girlfriend of Ricky Davis and house maverick Jane Hilton, had given an interview to a reporter. She was quoted saying, "Hilton's body was lying in bed like someone placed her there in the position she would normally sleep in." This statement seemed to contradict a muffled audio recording of a statement that Davis had previously made. Detective Fitzgerald falsely thought he heard him say the body was found on the floor. Dahl was, at the time, serving a jail sentence in Oregon on unrelated charges. Detectives brought her in for an interview and began a 3-hour-long interrogation. Initially, Dahl stuck to her original story. Over the next 18 months, though, she would be interrogated 4 times. Detectives were found to have used techniques known to increase the chances of a false confession. Dahl was systematically forced into incriminating Davis and Jane's daughter Autumn in the murder. Dahl was threatened with a charge of murder. If she cooperated, though, she'd be given a lenient sentence of manslaughter and serve only a year. Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald told Dahl that DNA evidence was going to be used to trace the suspect. In truth, no DNA evidence was brought into the case during that period. In truth, testing had not been done on the DNA recovered from the scene. By showing a crime scene photos and using facts from the crime, such as the bike mark on Jane's shoulder, investigators fed Dahl the information they wanted to hear. Over the course of the 4 interviews, Dahl was starting to break. She began remembering facts from the crowd. This in turn allowed her to fabricate and create an entirely different account of events from the night of the murder. In one interview, Dahl said that Autumn was present during the murder of Jane and was sprayed with blood. In another, she confessed that she was probably the person that bit Jane on the shoulder. Gull would say that the murder began with an argument between Davis and Jane. She alleged that Davis wanted Autumn to join them at a party. When Jane refused, Davis erupted in a fit of anger, leading to the death of Jane. Her story kept changing to fit the facts being fed. However, she couldn't remember the weapon used for the murder or where it was eventually hidden. Dahl had implicated her ex-boyfriend Davis in the murder of Jane Hilton. He was now the prime suspect. Ricky Davis and Autumn Anker were also interviewed following the confession of Connie Dahl. Both Davis and Anker stuck to their original accounts of the crime. Detectives again lied to Davis, telling him that Anker had also implicated him in the murder. Anker told detectives she had no reason to protect Davis when they threatened her with culpability regarding the murder. Despite their interrogation techniques, detectives could not sway Davis or Anker to change their stories. They therefore used the confession of Dahl to arrest Davis. Dahl was offered a plea bargain to testify against Davis at his trial. Davis's first trial was declared a mistrial by jurors. His second in 2005 would eventually convict him. Dahl took the stand and testified against Davis. She told the court of how she struggled with Jane and she herself accidentally bit the victim on the shoulder. She went on to say that she went outside as Davis continued the bloody assault on Hilton. Dahl said she could hear screaming, pleading, and gurgling as Davis continued the brutal attack. Based entirely on the testimony of Dahl's account of events, Davis was sentenced to 16 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Jane Hilton. Dahl received a lesser charge of manslaughter and received a year-long sentence at the county jail. Dahl, though, would eventually die from a drug overdose in 2014. Meanwhile, Davis was not going down without a fight. He maintained his innocence and in 2006, made contact with the Northern California Innocence Project. He asked if they could help him prove that he was wrongly convicted. The NCIP was founded in 2001 by Wayne Rodolphe and Linda Starr. The project began after legislation offered convicted inmates to seek DNA testing to prove their innocence. It's a non-profit clinical program of Santa Clara University School of Law. After Davis made contact with the NCIP in 2006, his case was put through a thorough re-examination. Cooperation between the NCIP and the El Turotar County District Attorney's Office allowed for the DNA recovered from the crime scene to be retested post-conviction. Evidence from the crime scene included Hilton's nightgown and biological material found under her fingernails. The results revealed an unknown male DNA profile. DNA from Hilton's fingernails and nightgown were both found to be from the same source. Test results eliminated Davis, Dahl, and Anker. This proved Dahl's testimony was contradictory to the physical evidence and therefore had to have been fabricated. The DNA also proved Archie Hilton innocent. Unfortunately, he had passed away by the time results were released. The DNA profile file was entered into the FBI Combined Index DNA system, CODIS, but no matches were found. Although the evidence seemed to prove Davis's consistent claim of innocence correct, there were some hurdles that still needed to be jumped. The NCIP successfully argued that had the DNA results been presented to the jury during Davis's trial, the outcome would be different. However, until January 2017, the California standard required that new evidence quite unerringly to innocence. It was considered an almost unattainable standard. In 2015, a false confession expert, Richard Leo, reviewed transcripts of Dahl's interrogations. Leo concluded that the methods used by detectives during the interrogation of Dahl were designed to pressure and persuade Dahl to adopt an account that matched the detectives' pre-existing beliefs about how and why the murder of Jane Hilton occurred. In 2016, though, the NCIP co-sponsored Senate Bill 1134. This bill allowed wrongfully convicted inmates like Davis to prove that new evidence would likely have been compelling to a jury. NCIP attorney Melissa O'Connor filed a petition for a new trial based on the new DNA evidence testing. Championed by former California State Senator Mark Leno, the bill was passed in January 2017, putting California's standard in line with bound of 43 other states. In 2019, Superior Court Judge Kenneth Malakian vacated Davis's 2005 conviction and ordered a new trial. Initially set to start in fall of 2019, however, the judge announced the trial would take place in April 2020, citing the defense attorney's health as the catalyst for change in date. However, the fate of the trial was about to change once again. Advancements in DNA testing led to Davis becoming the first convicted person in California and the second in the United States to be exonerated for a crime. Genetic genealogy is a fairly new DNA testing concept. Juror 1C0 to a man considered an unlikely suspect. El Dorado County Attorney Vern Pearson announced in February 2020 that a new suspect had been identified as the man linked to the DNA evidence found on Jane Hilton's body. Following the arrest, many people spoke to the media about the man they knew as Michael Green. Green was a longtime resident of Roseville, California. He graduated from Oakmount High School in 1986. He was described as an easygoing, kind person, even-tempered, and even super chill. One classmate who wanted to remain anonymous could not understand why Green would go to El Dorado Hills and brutally murder a woman. According to reports, Green was 17 years old at the time of Hilton's murder. On the night of July 6, 1985, the victim's daughter, Autumn, met Green and two of his friends, Calvin and Stephen. They hung out together at the park when Autumn decided to go home and have a shower before returning. Allegedly, Autumn told her mother she was going to another friend's house for the evening. Instead, she returned to the park to join the boys. What happened next is pure speculation. Investigators believe that during this time, Green broke into the house and was confronted by Jane. In a struggle to get away, Green may have attacked her in a frenzy. Following the attack, Jane's body was discovered by Davis, Dahl, and Otto when they returned home. Green had no criminal convictions either before or after the murder. It seems he'd led a normal life until DNA linked him to the gruesome crime. The other two boys who were with Green were tracked down shortly after his arrest. Kelvin, unfortunately, had died some time ago. Stephen, however, was found and interviewed the day after the arrest. He was being treated as a witness and not a participant. Green was arrested on February 11, 2020. Since Green was a teenager at the time of the murder, he made his first appearance at the juvenile court on February 19, 2020. District Attorney Vern Pearson said that, procedurally, the court has to go through some steps on the juvenile side of it. Following this, Green was granted a transfer so that he could be tried as an adult. He waited 2.5 years before he would be tried in court. Green pleaded no contest on July 29, 2022. This plea means Green gave up his right to a jury trial. A jury trial meant he was to face a charge of first-degree murder. He also gave up his chance to challenge the plea or the consequences of his decision. His sentencing date was set for September 27, 2022 to be presided over by Judge Suzanne Kingsbury. At sentencing, Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman, a professor in psychological science education, was called in on educational capacity to explain to the court the development of a penicillin. Kaufman's research explained the varying development needs of adolescents with regard to emotional and cognitive development. The late adolescent stage allowed an individual to understand right from wrong, yet at the same time they're also functioning under diminished capacity for impulse control. The defense called several witnesses from Green's childhood, some who even maintained relationships with them into adulthood. Each witness was asked if their opinion had changed of him since the knowledge of his confession. All witnesses agreed they'd been shocked to discover that he was responsible for the murder of Hilton. Individuals who knew him in varying capacities described him as jovial, popular, funny, and loving. These words were used to describe him before and after the murder. Green's ex-wife, Karen Green, said, "There's just not a bad bone in meth." After witness statements were given, each of Jane Hilton's children presented their victim impact statements. They all described the unforgivable loss that Green inflicted upon their family. "The why it happened and how different my life could have been will haunt me forever," said Heather Purvis McConnell, one of James' daughters. Argith Brandon, Hilton's fourth child, said, "I loved my mother and I assume Michael loves his mother too. I want to know what he would feel or what he would say to the person who stabbed your mother 29 times. What would you do if you received an early morning call to tell you your mother is dead?" The court listened to her description of the feeling of gathering her mother's belongings from the house in which she was killed. Ardith finished with a powerful declaration. "We will always have something in common, regretting the stupid decision you made 37 years ago." Hilton's son, Ian, echoed his sister's sentiments. He went on to explain the uncertainty the family faced and the recurring nightmares they suffered, especially after the crooked finger of blame was pointed at his own sister, Autumn. He broke down in tears as he ended with an almost inaudible remark. "All the words we say will never bring my mother back." Autumn was the last to speak. Her statement showed true agony as she recounted the cloud of suspicion she'd lived under for the last 2 decades. Recounting the day 2 crew-cup thick-mustached detectives came into her house telling her they found the people responsible for her mother's death. She was then repeatedly accused of biting her mother and helping move her body from the floor to the bed. Autumn went on to say that if she hadn't said the word lawyer at that point, she did not know how much further the intimidation tactics of the investigators could have gone. Afterwards, Deputy District Attorney Jay Linden read a statement on behalf of the family. In the statement, he asked Green what made him end Jane's life in such a brutal manner. "You beat her. She had numerous wounds around her head and face. By your own words, you kicked her jaw. You bit her on the shoulder. Why was that?" Linden continued to read the statement that expressed how Green didn't just murder Jane. He destroyed numerous lives in the process. Linden then asked Green if he'd given any thought about Jane and who she was. He pointed out her achievements and the love she had for each of her children. In closing arguments, Margaret Husher, Green's defense attorney, stressed the idea that he was unable to stop himself. She emphasized that he did not know what he was doing was wrong, as he was an adolescent at the time. This argument was based on the testimony of expert witness, Dr. Kaufman. She asked that the court show mercy as she read off the multiple penal codes and rules of the court. Judge Kingsbury interjected by saying, "The court is not going to put him on formation," effectively ending any further comment from the defense. In response, Linden thanked the court and said the application for probation was offensive. He said, "It was a smack to this family who had endured this pre-tikings." Linden stated that he already got away with murder for 37 years. Placing him on probation allowed him to get away with more. Judge Kingsbury said she had heard a multitude of arguments about murder cases surrounding adolescent development. She remarked that after her 26 years on the bench, Jane Hilton's murder was by far the most brutal. Before passing her sentence, Kingsbury asked the family for their forgiveness for the trauma they had suffered, although she was not originally assigned the case. She also hoped they would heal from the pain as it would have been their mother's wish. Kingsbury then encouraged Green to use all resources at his disposal in the California Department of Rehabilitation. "You're the key to the questions these people have. Doing that could ultimately help you with your outcome as it relates to parole," said Kingsbury. In closing, Kingsbury pointed out that she had heard from his friends that there's a great side to him and that he has much to offer. She also said he was young enough to be released and live a productive life. Green was sentenced to 15 years to life and remained it to the El Dorado County Jail. He will then be transferred to the California Department of Rehabilitation. Restitution will be decided after further consideration by the court. Davis was released on February 13, 2020 and planned to celebrate over pizza with his family. His lawyer, Melissa O'Connell, said he will be entitled to more than $750,000 in state compensation for the wrongful conviction. Although the amount was high enough for him to re-enter society in a fresh, O'Connell said it could not make up for the years of freedom that he lost. Davis went on to sue the state for damages, covering the period from May 21, 2002 to February 13, 2020 for a whopping $18 million. The lawsuit names El Dorado County as well as former detectives Richard Strasser, Rick Fitzgerald, Bill Wilson, who's deceased and been sued through his estate, and Larry Hennig. Sheriff's Office pathologist, Dr. Robert Anthony, has also been included in the complaint. The Village Life newspaper reported that Davis was homeless after being released. The lawsuit is still pending as of 2022. In September 2022, California passed Assembly Bill 2644. This bill would, commencing January 1, 2024, prohibit law enforcement officers from employing threats, physical harm, deception, or psychological manipulative interrogation tactics as specified during a custodial interrogation of a person 17 years of age or younger. The bill faced opposition, but District Attorney Van Pearson is urging all law enforcement to stop using intimidation tactics. Pearson stated that 10 years ago, he would have viewed the methods used to get a confession differently. However, after seeing the true impact it can have, he believed there is room for change. This also comes after research points to deceptive tactics being used for years by law enforcement that will presume guilt and focus on getting a confession, rather than getting the full story. The district attorney is implementing this new policy in his office and is urging other district attorneys to do the same. El Dorado County DA's office will now reject any case where the primary evidence is a confession obtained using threats, lies, or psychological manipulation interrogation tactics. These measures are to ensure that no one is ever again convicted based on a coerced false confession like the case of Ricky Davis. Pearson personally apologized to all involved in the miscarriage of justice caused by the tactics used by Ben investigators into the brutal 1985 murder of Jane Hilton. After 37 years, the right man is finally facing justice. Yet the lives of so many were left broken by mistakes and false accusations. For Jane Hilton's family, hopefully, they can now pick up the pieces after being divided over the innocence of their own sister, Anam. Ricky Davis can never regain the liberty he lost, and Michael Green destroyed not only the lives of the victim's family and friends, but the lives that he touched in the years before and after the murder. What are your thoughts on today's case? Did Michael Green deserve the sentence he received? Does this clean record, minus the murder, make him innocent of intentional murder? How could he let an innocent man take the blame for his actions? Can Ricky Davis ever get his life back on track even when he does receive compensation? And why is it taking so long? The police rushed to the scene of a horrifying crime, desperately hoping to save 9-year-old Andrew and his 14-month-old sister, Naomi. A ruthless attack had been carried out on the Hockensmith family, leaving no traces behind and presenting one of the most challenging cases the detectives had ever faced. Fortunately, witnesses came forward, and their testimonies helped reveal the tragic truth behind the events that befell the Hockensmiths. In 2013, in Danville, Kentucky, 35-year-old Michael Hockensmith, a former priest, had taken full control of the local pawnshop, ABC Gold, games, and more due to the former owner's declining health. Known for his honesty and warmth, Michael easily connected with people and was always eager to help. His marriage to Angie was admired by many, and with the arrival of their 2 children, their bond only grew stronger. The Hockensmiths were a happy family, and their business flourished, becoming a trusted local venture. Regular customers, including broker Dan Smith, frequently visited the pawnshop, particularly on Fridays. Life appeared idyllic for the Hockensmiths until a fateful day in 2013 when an unknown man shattered their peace. 6 minutes after a distress call, police officers arrived at the scene. Inside, they were confronted by a grisly sight, a blood trail leading to Michael Hockensmith's lifeless body. Nearby, they discovered his 38-year-old wife, Angie, and behind the counter, the third victim, 60-year-old Dan Smith. All 3 had suffered fatal gunshot wounds to the head and torso. The tragedy left a deep mark on the community and set the stage for a relentless search for justice. A few minutes later, officers found Andrew Hockensmith and his little sister Naomi hiding in a closet. The officers' accounts indicated the unimaginable horror these young children had endured. Suddenly, the 9-year-old boy and his 14-month-old sister were left orphaned, having lost both parents. Upon examining the crime scene, police found 14 spent .22 caliber shell casings and 3 intact bullets, along with a briefcase that belonged to Dan Smith. The victim's personal belongings and all the cash in the register were left untouched, suggesting that robbery was not the motive for the crime. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras in the pawn shop, posing a significant obstacle to the investigation. The police had no choice but to rely on finding potential witnesses to the crime. An employee of the nearby Rain Boy Cleaners was able to describe a car that had parked near the building that morning. It was a silver minivan driven by a large man with a thick beard. While one group of investigators searched the surrounding area, another informed the closest relatives about the tragedy that had befallen their loved ones. Michael's parents found it difficult to accept the circumstances that someone in their right mind could wish harm to their children. Nevertheless, they tried to find any positive aspect in the situation, and the fact that their grandchildren had survived could not but rejoice them. Soon, the tragic news reached the daughter of the third victim, Dan Smith. He was involved in buying precious metals and skillfully adapted to the specifics of his work. Easily finding common ground with different people. His business involved handling large sums of cash, sometimes exceeding $100,000. This led the police to consider the theory that Dan Smith himself could have been the primary target of the criminal. Tracking the man's movements revealed that before he arrived at the ABC Gold Games and More pawn shop, he had visited Lawson's jewelry store in Harrodsburg, located 10 miles northeast of Danville. In the jewelry store, investigators found a surveillance camera positioned on the far wall to capture every visitor entering and exiting the store. They hoped that the recording would help them determine if anyone had been following Dan Smith. Smith entered the store at 8:16 in the morning, and there were no other customers in the building at the time. He was carrying the same briefcase that was later found at the ABC Gold Games and More pawn shop. After greeting the woman behind the counter with a smile, headed to the back of the store. Sometime later, Dan Smith reappeared on the footage coming out from the back of the store, saying something to an elderly woman who had just entered, and then immediately leaving. It was a typical day in the life of the jewelry store. The external camera recording showed nothing suspicious. The police were left to helplessly monitor the man who had no idea he would soon be at the center of a tragic event. Meanwhile, 9-year-old Andrew Hawkins Smith was taken to the police station to give his testimony. Andrew described how he had been at the pawn shop with his parents when Dan Smith arrived carrying a bag full of money. While his father and Dan were talking, the stranger entered and immediately demanded the bag. According to the boy, Dan Smith immediately handed over his briefcase, after which the stranger shot him. My father asked him to stop, but he also shot him with a pistol similar to the one I play with, Andrew said. Meanwhile, the mother instructed Andrew to take Naomi to the back of the store and hide in the closet. Andrew took his little sister and hid. It was then that the criminal aimed the gun at Angie. I don't know who he is and why he did it, but it seems to me that the reason was money, the 9-year-old boy concluded. He described the stranger as a very tall man with a blonde beard that looked fake, matching the description provided by a witness from Rainbow Cleaners. To follow all possible leads, the police's next step was to thoroughly examine the business run by the Hawkins-Smith family. It turned out that the ABC Gold Games and More pawn shop had another owner, Steve Devine. While he usually attended Friday deals with Dan Smith, he was absent on the tragic morning of September 20th. This information raised concerns, making determining his whereabouts a top priority. Steve Devine explained that he had developed an allergy that morning and was forced to cancel all his appointments, a story confirmed by his wife. The alibi and the fact that Steve Devine did not own a silver minivan helped to rule him out as a suspect. He also explained why there were no surveillance cameras in the pawn shop. According to him, the security system had been removed by the previous owner, Kenneth Allen Keith, and the new owners had not yet installed a replacement. 48-year Keith, like his deceased friend, Michael Hawkins Smith, was a priest. Pastor Keith sold the pawn shop when he was diagnosed with brain cancer, but he remained the owner of another similar establishment, Gold Rush Buyers in Pulaski County, neighboring Danville's Boyle County. Michael's family revealed that he prayed for his friend every evening, hoping for his recovery. Their friendship, which began when Michael worked at a youth church camp, had lasted for 15 years. The Hawkins-Smith family always held Pastor Keith in high regard, and for their son, Andrew, he was like a beloved uncle. With no significant leads, investigators decided to try their luck in finding possible street surveillance systems near the ABC Gold Games and Moore Pawn Shop. They found a camera on the office building of the real estate office, Danville Rentals. The surveillance footage captured a silver minivan at 8:45 in the morning, but the image was too blurry to identify the license plate or the make of the vehicle. Once again, the police had to rely on the witnesses' testimony from rainbow cleaners, which described the car as an old model with a distinctive square body shape. The car in the video clearly showed a square rear bumper that matched to this description. The color, type, and shape of the car all indicated that the police had found the criminal's vehicle. They continued to search for surveillance systems farther and farther from the pawn shop. At 8:17 in the morning, the camera at the local Ephraim McDowell Hospital captured the same vehicle. And finally, investigators were able to determine that it was a silver Dodge minivan. Michael and Angela's family organized a candlelight vigil in their memory. Hundreds of compassionate people attended that evening, demonstrating the depth of love for their lost ones. Similarly, like the Hawkins Smith family, Dan Smith's close relatives were outraged that the whims of another had led to the loss of their loved one. Despite their grief, they chose not to let anger overshadow their other emotions and joined in the funeral proceedings. Meanwhile, the Danville Police Department appealed to the public for any information about the criminal or his vehicle. Immediately after this, on September 24th, the police received a call from Tracy Harold, a pastor in Warren, Michigan. He claimed to be a friend of Kenneth Keith and mentioned that during their last conversation, they touched on the topic of the murder in Danville. And at that moment, Mr. Keith seemed to change. Pastor Kenneth Allen informed his friend that on that particular day, he was driving to Danville for medicine for his wife. He also expressed a sense of guilt for what happened, as he had given Michael Hockensmith the opportunity to become the owner of his former business. Keith put forward the theory that Dan Smith himself could have been the main target of the attacker. Keith explained that Dan would come to him every Sunday to pawn all his gold, always carrying large sums of cash with him. Keith speculated that someone might have tracked Dan's route and ultimately targeted him, but there was more to the story. As it turned out, the pastor's relationship with the Hawkins Smith family was not as everyone had believed. These words raised suspicions, leading to Pastor Keith being added to the list of suspects. To verify his alibi, investigators decided to review the surveillance footage from the Good Neighbor Pharmacy, where, according to the pastor, he bought medicine for his wife. At 9:24 in the morning, a man entered the pharmacy, indeed Pastor Kenneth Allen Keith, but he looked nothing like the man who had committed the triple attack just minutes earlier. He was not wearing a green jacket or a beard, which were distinctive features of the assailant. However, this did not rule out his involvement in the attack. There was a 7-minute gap between Andrew Hawkins Smith's call to the police and the pastor's arrival at the pharmacy. The police decided to check if it was possible to travel from the crime scene to the Good Neighbor Pharmacy in such a short time. They found that the trip took about 5 minutes in total, so it was plausible to commit the murders, quickly get into a car, and reach the pharmacy to establish a solid alibi. The key clue was that Pastor Keith had an unregistered 2008 Dodge minivan, which was silver. However, all the evidence found was circumstantial, and it was not enough for an arrest. So investigators turned to Tracy Harold to participate in a series of fake phone calls aimed at the suspect. Luckily, Tracy agreed. During these calls, Pastor Keith finally revealed his true feelings towards the Hawkins Smith family. And then what everyone had been waiting for happened. Keith began discussing details of the case that had not been made public. Pastor Kenneth Keith explained that he left Danville and returned to Somerset. He then took his car to the car wash to prepare it for a planned family vacation. At 10:50 in the morning, Keith was seen on camera walking down the hallway to the cashier's counter with a noticeable smile. It seemed clear that he was not involved in the dreadful crime that occurred earlier that morning. The external camera footage covering the parking lot showed Pastor Kenneth leaving the car wash in the same silver Dodge at 11:25, matching all the images previously obtained from various surveillance systems in Danville. At that point, they had enough evidence to arrest the suspect. He was offered a polygraph test to prove or alleviate his involvement in the pawnshop crime, but his response was rather unusual. Keith stated that he would not be able to pass the polygraph successfully because during his military service, he was tasked with eliminating 3 individuals. The investigators obtained a warrant to search Kenneth Allen Keith's pawn shop, where they discovered a fake beard and a significant amount of cash. The police could not find any legitimate explanation for how he acquired most of the money. They also found bundles of bills wrapped in a ribbon with the name of the bank that issued them, revealing Dan Smith as their client. Further investigation revealed that the money found in Keith's pawn shop had recently been withdrawn from the account of a dead broker. Additionally, several .22 caliber casings were found in Keith's pawn shop. According to ballistics analysis, they were fired from the same weapon used to shoot the parents of young Andrew and Naomi. Based on all the evidence found, Kenneth Allen Keith was charged with 3 counts of deliberate homicide and first-degree robbery. It turned out that Pastor Keith believed that Michael Hawkinsmith and Steve Devine had conspired to get rid of him from the business. Knowing that Dan Smith carried large sums of money, Keith decided to exact his revenge on the day of their planned meeting at the pound shop. Keith aimed to mislead law enforcement into thinking the crime was motivated by robbery. In reality, Michael Hawkinsmith and his partner, Steve Devine, had no involvement in the imagined conspiracy against Keith. During the investigation, no evidence of discreditable activities by Michael Hawkinsmith and Steve Devine was found. On September 20th, the criminal arrived in Danville in his silver Dodge Caravan. He circled the pawn shop for a while until he noticed Dan Smith's car parked nearby. The first victim was the broker himself, followed by Michael and then Angela Hawkinsmith. The pastor then took all the cash from Dan Smith's case and calmly left the crime scene, stopping at the Good Neighbor Pharmacy to be captured on its surveillance cameras and secure an alibi. His decision to go to the car wash was another attempt to remove traces and destroy any evidence that might have been left on his vehicle. In 2017, just before the trial, Kenneth Allen Keith pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Before the trial, investigators obtained medical documents from the Veterans Hospital and discovered that the pastor had never had a brain tumor. How could someone who seemed so spiritually inclined commit such a heinous crime? Furthermore, how was he going to live with the knowledge of what he had done? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.